Hey everyone, so today's impossible piece that I want to talk about learning through microscopic strategy is Chopin's famous Nocturne in E flat major, opus 9, number 2. It looks a little something like this. So how would it be possible in the most extreme case for a total beginner to even attempt this or consider attempting it, or even if it's a beginner intermediate student that's learned for maybe 2-3 years, this would still be a really big reach goal. And I posit it's actually still within the realm of possibility, believe it or not. I think traditional teachers would not think it's a good idea, but it's possible if you're highly skilled in strategy, logic, decision-making, your raw skill at making decisions or micro-decisions independent of talent, hard work, piano technique, theory, etc. If we can cultivate that, this becomes in the realm of possibility. Of course, there's going to be other factors as well, but using my logical methodology, which I'll explain a little bit of in this video, I'll try to describe how it's possible to go from super small little sections of a super high quality to gradually larger and larger chunks, and the coordination will link together in this elegant and non-traditional way. So yeah, on this channel I hope to share with you guys strategies, thoughts, mindsets, etc., often of my own creation that I hope will help you in your piano playing, hopefully other areas of your life as well. So briefly, I will go through some concepts here. If you've been following the channel, you have heard these before, but I know that a lot of people, this might be the first video of mine that you're watching. So I would speak briefly first about spaced repetitions, or just the idea of not doing something over and over again as in massed repetition, but instead if you forget something, move on, come back, you have to relearn, and every single time that you forget and relearn, that cognitive effort of retrieval is actually making it stronger in your brain. So rather than doing something 7 times in a row or 50 times in a row, if you purposely move on from it, forget it, come back, and then relearn it 7 times, and that's on purpose, it's actually by design, it's really a win-win situation, because if you remember it, that's of course great, but if you forget it, that was your own intention anyway. So if you forget and relearn 7 times, that's like getting a whole week's worth of practice in one day or in one session possibly. And I believe that there's also this idea of using the forgetting of one thing to help the learning of other things. So for example, if you learn and then rapidly move on from 10 or 20 small sections, by the time you get to the end of the 20th section, I mean, you've likely forgotten the first section. And so if you go through, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, all the way to 20, then you go back and then you relearn all of those elements again. I mean, you could cycle through that 3 times or 4 times, and each of those elements is getting stronger because of the spaced repetition that you've introduced in between. I sometimes will have this little analogy to foreign language learning. So if you learn a new phrase, a new foreign language phrase, if you repeat it to yourself 20 times, that of course proves nothing, except that it's in your short-term memory. But if you were to review it with flashcards and you have spacing in between when you've seen the information, when you review it again, each time, that will help that effort of retrieval. And such it is with musical phrases as well, too. So it's tempting to just play things 20 times right after you learn it, but that's really not going to do much for your long-term memory compared to moving on and then coming back, purposely forgetting and relearning. Now, in music making and playing the piano, we want to link together progressively more complicated coordinations. And so one of the other main parts of my method, one of the many other parts, would be my rule of expansion. You can also search David Chang rule of expansion if you're curious about this. And it's this idea of, if you do these tiny little sections to quality, you move on, you come back, you don't merely review them, but you'll actually make them grow larger over time. You'll combine them together. So if you did, for instance, quarters of a measure, and you did a whole bunch of quarters of measures, when you come back, you might link those quarters into halves. The third time you come back, you might link those halves into ones. My rule of transition also describes how you would link separate hands into both hands. If you search David Chang rule of transition, if you want some more explanation around that, I'll probably go over it very briefly in this video. And there's also a notational system to keep track of your work. And briefly here, I would say that humans are terrible at remembering things. So if I ask you to get 40 items from the grocery store, you can't remember them. But once you write them down in a grocery list, you now have an external brain. You've distributed cognition that frees up all of your mental resources to then make other connections between things. And humans are great at making connections between things, between their calendar, the grocery list, the list of projects. There's all these opportunities and connections that we can make. So if you can keep track of the tiny little sections that you're practicing, because I was saying it's useful to move on, come back, relearn things. It's useful to combine smaller things into larger and larger things in the learning of music or piano coordinations. And so I would posit that it's very useful to keep track of your work. If you want to be a strong strategist on the battlefield, so to speak, if you can keep track of all these different little tiny sections that you've practiced, you'll be much better equipped to execute amazing decision making. Because once you start practicing twelfths of a measure, quarters of a measure, ones, and I'll show you how I keep track of the work as we go through a little bit of this nocturne. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to keep track of every single little micro decision. But when you write them down, not only can you remember every single little tiny section that you've practiced, all the tiny fractions of measures, but you can also see opportunities much more easily. You may see a pair of quarter measure areas next to each other. You may see a pair or a grouping of 3/12ths of a measure next to each other. And you might say, oh, I can combine this here. I see a weak point here. This area seems stronger, so I don't need to practice that. It just opens up a whole realm of possibilities that you might not even have considered had all of your mental headspace been taken up with just remembering what it is that you've done. So a big part of this is also the old school demand for quality itself. So when you're doing these tiny little sections, I'm not interested, but I will just say now, I'm not interested in a large section played to a poor quality, which is what would happen with almost any, let's say a total beginner or a beginner wants to try to play this piece. They'll probably play both hands slowly, very poorly, if at all, and then they would give up, and or the teacher would have them give up. I'm also not interested in medium sections of an okay quality. I'm not interested in small sections of a pretty good quality. I'm interested in probably necessarily very small sections of an excellent quality, as close to perfection as we can get, even though perfect isn't even a thing, really. But let's say a really excellent quality. And that's what it'll make it possible for us to piece things together. So if you understand all the concepts I just threw out there, you want to do something, probably it has to be very small, because if you were to play something slightly larger in front of me, I would probably say that's not a good quality at all. But you can play some little thing, even if it's 2 notes, 2 chords, or 3 chords. And if I say, like, that's an excellent quality, now we have really great puzzle pieces to work with. And they could just be separate hand, tiny little sections. And then once we have that, then it becomes a matter of making those tiny sections get larger, transitioning into both hands, and then making those tiny little both hand sections get larger and larger. So let me see if I can show some examples now that I've given this. And with these different videos, I feel like I'm probably going to re-explain this in a different way. Sometimes there will be some of the same things, but I find that because humans are so forgetful, we really need so much repetition. Sometimes it's the same. Sometimes in piano lessons, really, piano teachers just get paid to say the same exact thing every single week, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 3 months, 6 months. Other times there's little nuances that come up over time, different types of repetition, and records in different areas of your brain. And so just giving this explanation that I just gave in terms of the small expanding to the large, starting something really great, like little jewels, little wonderful puzzle pieces that then piece together into larger and larger things. I am going to explain that in so many different ways, I think, as I continue to make more videos, because I feel like I've even underestimated how valuable that is. And so if you followed my reasoning all the way up to this point, it means that even if you can do separate hand, very tiny little sections, if you follow this method or this general reasoning correctly and you're able to execute it correctly, you'll be able to link it into both hand large sections and eventually the entire piece. Of course, it might take either a really diligent, careful person or a really great teacher to help guide you through some of it. But let me show you some examples of our work in this piece. So in my logical methodology, I refer to what I call sets And a set is just any section plus the next beat, plus the next chord or the next vertical. So for example, let's take well, I guess we can use this measure here. So this measure, if I'm play this entire measure and then the next chord, let's just say it's over here for simplicity's sake, then this would be a one measure set, one measure plus the next beat. Now, if you notice here, you can see visually, even if you're a beginner, that this is split into quarters of a measure. This is the first quarter, like from here to here. This is the second quarter. This is the third quarter or so, and this is the fourth quarter. So you can see that visually they're grouped this way. They're not always grouped this way, so you would have to make your best approximation if you are on your own. But so we can see that those are quarters. These would be halves. And indeed, if we wanted to talk about a half measure set, for instance, let me see if I can erase this. Okay, if we want to talk about a half measure set, for instance, then we may do from here to here, for instance. So a half measure set would be half of a measure plus the next beat. Here, this would be half of a measure plus the next beat or the next chord, as designated by these triangles. Maybe I could choose a different color. Maybe that'd be nice. And then quarter measure sets would be a quarter of a measure. So again, quarter of a measure plus one more chord, quarter of a measure plus one more chord. So I'm just writing these little symbols to help visually remind you of where it is that we are. And it's also possible, of course, to have things like 2 measure sets, 4 measure sets. I won't get into the details in this video, but actually this seems like a sensible pair, like from here to there. So let's say, for instance, let's say I use the green. If I were to, say, use huge triangles, like from here to here, this would be 1 measure, 2 measures, plus 1 more beat. So that's what I'm thinking of. And I'm going to start to keep track of the sections that I hypothetically practice. So all of these are just visual reminders. They are not my actual logical notation. I would write these for students, for beginners, for new students, so that they actually understand what I'm talking about when I say a quarter measure set. Like a quarter of a measure plus the next beat would be circle to circle. Half measure set, half a measure plus the next beat, triangle to triangle. And a 2 measure set from green triangle to green triangle is 2 measures plus 1 more beat. I'm just doing that to remind people of what it is that I'm doing or what section I'm talking about. But if you actually solve like a 1 measure set, for instance, so from here, 1 measure all the way to here, this would indicate that you actually did it correctly. So this 1 inside of these weird little brackets here, this would signify that I've played 1 measure plus the next chord perfectly or to the best quality that I can. And if I were to mark a half measure set, let's say that I played from purple triangle to purple triangle, if I wanted to mark that, then I would mark half of a measure plus the next beat. If I wanted to indicate I solved a quarter measure set, when I say solved, I mean played perfectly correctly or to a high quality from blue circle to blue circle, then I would mark quarter, like this. So this helps me to keep track of my work. If I did from here to here, this would be another quarter measure, set in my logical methodology. So that's what would happen there. Now, how do we go about, like, where do we even start with this? Well, in my methodology, these curly brackets, they indicate both hand segments. So this would be right and left hand both play this quarter of a measure plus the next beat. This is actually a fairly complicated coordination. So we actually won't start with both hand segments. We're actually going to start with separate hand sets. And it doesn't matter at all about the colors, honestly. So separate hand sets, I would indicate them within square brackets in my methodology. So let me erase all these both hand markings for a moment here. Erase this word. Maybe let's use this pretty color. Is that different enough from the, maybe let's use this one. Okay, so I didn't even select anything. Okay. I would probably start with quarter measure separate hand sets at most. So if I were having a student play this, he or she would play from here to here. So a quarter of a measure plus the next chord, and then I would have them mark quarter. And this just means right hand alone. It's vertically aligned over the start point always. So it's right hand alone, this chord plus the next chord. Then I would have the student play from here to here. Now, let's just assume that the person has learned piano for, let's say, 2-3 years or something like that, or maybe a little more. Let's say that they're not a total beginner. If they were a total beginner, I'd have to start from probably even smaller than this. But let's say that they have some experience. If they had like no experience and they deeply wanted to play this, I would have to start like from here to here. And this is actually a third of a quarter, more or less, like from here to here. And so I would actually mark like 1/12 if I wanted to keep track of that. And I actually would track that. So instead of that, let's assume the person's skilled enough to play right hand alone from here to here, which is actually already pretty difficult. And so here to here, this would actually be another quarter measure set. Now I'm going to say briefly, the default means of solving any separate hand set is adding in reverse. And if you want to search David Chang adding in reverse, if you search David Chang 14 layers of strategy as applied to river flows, and you have a whole playlist. I talk about adding in reverse as, as applied to separate hand sets. So I won't go into all the details here, but basically you might play like just the last chord, you might play the last 2 chords, you might play the last 3 chords, and then the entire 4 chords. And that's your default strategy for solving any separate hand set. It's actually the default strategy for solving any set, but I'll say that it's no more complicated than this for a separate hand set. If it goes wrong, then you would go back to the blue, the green, the yellow, the red, etc. And all of this is just so that you can mark this in the end. And it's always going to be played left to right when you do that, just so you know. So I feel like this is like teaching like a painting class or something like that, just like marking the pretty colors. So this would be right hand alone, quarter of a measure plus the next beat. Now we have this next part, quarter of a measure from here to here. Again, we're assuming the person has some experience. If they have basically no experience, I would have to make sure that they're physically playing healthily. If you search David Chang holding and relaxing or David Chang physical methodology, you'll find a lot of videos on technique and such that I've made. I would make sure that they are relaxed and that they're playing healthily, etc. And then I would probably even start with 12th measure sets if it's like a super ambitious total beginner, and just have them play like only from here to here, only from here to here, mark a 12th, etc., etc. But let's assume that the person has some experience. So it's a very ambitious, but it's not as insane a goal as if they were total beginners. So again, from here to here, I would add in reverse, play like here to here, here to here, here to here, and then I would mark a quarter, and then let's say that we solve the last quarter of the measure in the same way. Let's erase this both hand set marker for a moment. And here we would play from here to here. I mean, this ornament, there's other stuff I can say about it, but for sake of time, I'll just ignore that for now. Here to here, here to here. So we solve this quarter measure area. And then now normally, because this video is already 18 minutes long, I would cover a much wider area. So that means like if I can determine that the student can do this sort of thing to quality, or if you can determine that yourself, that means that you've mastered this type of problem, and then I would cover a very wide area. I mean, I know that there are some more complications here, but for simplicity's sake in this simple thought experiment, let's assume that you solved right-hand quarter measure sets for a wide area. And when I say wide, I mean covering like the entire rest of this page, ideally, or at least 4 lines. Why? Because we don't want to get stuck in one spot. So if a quarter measure separate hand set is all that the person can do right now, then so be it. Then do it until it can't be done anymore. And I think I'm going to say this in other videos too. Because if you can't do anything more complicated than this, why not do a lot of whatever that thing is? Anything larger than this right now, you're not ready for it yet. So instead, just do a lot of whatever that thing is. And sometimes, like for instance here, you can see that this quarter measure set, because this is a quarter, this is a quarter, this is a quarter, this is a quarter. This quarter is on drugs or something. That's what I was saying to a student earlier. It's so much more complicated. You can just tell visually. And so it makes sense that when you're doing from here, like, actually, I literally taught this earlier today. You would do a 12th measure set because this is a quarter, and so this is a third of this quarter. and then I would just do from here to here, and you can even do like 2 notes, 3 notes, you could do the last 2 notes, last 3 notes, last 4 notes, entire 5 notes, and then I would mark a 12th. That's really messy, but it's supposed to be a 12th. Then mark a 12th here. 12th, let's see, it would be from here to there, just right hand by itself, here to here, just right hand by itself. So that's the way that I would get started. So it can vary. Sometimes it can be quarters, sometimes it can be 12ths. Anyway, so let's say that you covered these quarters and or 12ths for a wide area. Then you would come back and do the same thing with the left hand. So I am not doing well at selecting these colors. Let's say that I just did blue for some reason. So the left hand, from here to here, this would be a quarter measure set in the left hand. And ideally, it would be vertically aligned beneath the starting points. So I could also do adding and reverse. I could play just this note. I could play this chord to this note, left to right. Then I could play this chord, this note, these 3 things, and then the whole thing. And then I can mark a quarter. That's a little messy because I wrote it over this pedaling marking, sorry. Then from here to here, you could do adding and reverse, just this chord, 2, 3, the entire thing. Mark a quarter. So we solve all of the quarter measure sets this way. And again, each time it means I can do a quarter of a measure plus the next note. So for instance, from here to here, I might do the last note, these 2, these 3, then the entire thing, and then I mark this. And in terms of doing this to quality, let me turn around the camera for a moment because you haven't seen me in a while. I am talking about, actually, I think you can search that because I have so many videos. Like, in those videos, I'm always going to refer you to other videos. It's like a custom, like, course, I guess, depending on what's most useful to you. I mean, for my students and for the students that are with us, actually, we can basically create a custom course for them because we're referencing the videos that are most useful to them at that time. But anyway, so I think there's a video I made called What I Mean by Quality. You can just David Chang quality, David Chang piano quality or something, or David Chang What I Mean by Quality. And I think that you'll be able to find that. But basically, it's like correct notes, fingerings, rhythm, ideally articulation, if possible, and there's no stopping at all. Ideally, it's from memory, and it's nice and solid. You can also search David Chang all loud with accents. Touch, if you like. That's part of my physical methodology playlist. Anyway, so each one of these you want to do to quality. So that's how I would get started. You can start with quarters, you can start with 12ths, and then the important thing is that they're really, really, really good. They're really solid. Ideally, they're from memory. You've constructed them well. And then you would use what I call my rule of expansion. So if you did this with left hand, you would also do left hand and cover like the entire page or cover like a whole bunch of lines. Then you come back again. And my rule of expansion, if you search David Chang rule of expansion, you might find it. If you see 2 adjacent sets of the same size and quality next to each other, you should try to expand them. So we have these 2 quarters, and we're going to try to expand them into half measures. I mean, I go through the reasoning in that rule of expansion video. Maybe I should make another video like that. So it's the same strategy, actually. I would do maybe the last chord, and then you could do like the last 2 chords. You could do the last 3 chords. You could do the last 4 chords. So you've basically reconstructed this entire quarter measure set, and then you could do the entire thing. And then hopefully you've then linked this together. So the fact that you've done these quarters on their own, left them, maybe memory consolidated during sleep, maybe you're coming back the next day, now you're linking them. Now they should be in a place that they're more likely to be able to be linked together. Believe it or not, if you had done the half outright on the first day, there's a much lower chance of success because maybe the section isn't sticking as well as when you forgot it and then came back again. So there's definitely more nuance to this, but this is the general way that we would link together these quarter measure right-hand sets into half measure right-hand sets. So again, this is my rule of expansion that you always just try to go for it when coming back if you see 2 adjacent sets of the same size and quality next to each other. So it's the same thing here. When we link together those quarter measure sets into this half measure set, you might do the last 2 chords, last 3, last 4, last 5, last 6, and then the entire thing, and then we end up with this half measure set. And you can cover like the entire page that way. If you search David Chang global versus staggered spaced repetition strategy, you can get some more nuance if you're curious about how to like when to cover an entire page or the entire piece versus coming back for more, coming back to the beginning more often. Anyway, then we would do the same thing for these quarters in the left hand after you'd covered a wide area with the right hand. So to link these two quarter measure sets into half measure set, it might be the same thing where you do the last 2 chords, last 3, last 4, last 5, last 6, and then you do the entire 7 elements here. And you link these quarters into halves like this. Let's see. Okay. And then you would solve this in the same way, construct this together, add in reverse, and combine those 2 quarters into half measure left-hand sets, and then you would cover the entire page that way. Now you would use, you could consider using my rule of transition now to go from separate, because all of this was within separate hands, and you'd cover the whole page or a very wide area with it. And all of it, you must preserve the quality of your playing. So it's really got to be super, super solid. Everybody plays too fast, too light. Just play nice and slow and solid. Don't worry about musicality for now, although it's important to play healthily. So that's why I think my physical methodology playlist might be useful. And then you can use rule of transition. Now, rule of transition is just when you've done separate hand sets that are at least twice as large as the both hand sets that you'll attempt, then you can try those both hand sets that are only half as large. So for instance, we just did half measure separate hand sets through the whole page. That could take, like quite a while of practice. It might be a week or a few weeks before you get to that point, depending on your level. And then you would come back and you would do no larger than a quarter measure both hand sets. And this would mean that you did, like, you're not trying to do a half measure both hands. So like if you can juggle flaming torches in one hand and knives in the other hand, you are not going to be able to do both of them at once necessarily. It's not like a 1 + 1 = 2 sort of scenario. And so I would attempt no larger than quarter measure both hand sets. And that's what I would do here. So the first quarter measure set would be from here to here. And if you search my name in 14 Layers of Strategy, there is a layer where I talk about adding in reverse for both hands, and that goes into more detail. But basically, you add in reverse separate than both for each step. This particular quarter measure set isn't as bad because the right hand isn't doing as much. But essentially, you might do just this vertical. You could do right hand, left hand, and then both hands. And then if you wanted to, you could go from here to here, right hand, left hand, both hands, then here to here, right hand, left hand, both hands, and then the whole thing right, left, both. And even though the right is basically just holding this chord most of the time. So in any case, at this point, you could erase these separate hand markers, and then I could write in the curly brackets, because before I was using the square brackets for separate hands, that we've done this with quarter measure both hand set over here. And now we have from here to here, because I'd done the half measure right hand set from here to here and the half measure left hand set from here to here. And again, a set is just half a measure plus the next beat. Therefore, I can attempt this quarter measure set too. Now, there's 2 things that can happen here. One is that you might be successful in playing the quarter measure set, so you end up doing it smoothly. Let's just talk through that briefly. So if that happens, then this is how the solve would go. It might be that, let me see, you do just this vertical, right hand alone, left hand alone, and then both. And then you do from here to here, right hand alone, left to right, left hand alone, and then both. Then you play like right hand alone, left hand alone, and then both. And then the entire thing, right hand alone, left hand alone, both. And this 12-step process, that's your default strategy. If it doesn't go well, then you go right back to step 1 again. You do all the 12 steps again. All of that is the default strategy to solve or play well this quarter measure both hand set. And then you would solve all the quarter measure both hand sets in that way. So, well, I thought I would go into like a little bit more detail in this video, and now it's ended up being like a half-hour long video. So I applaud you if you've gotten this far. That's pretty much the gist of it. And I would solve all the quarter measure both hand sets on the whole page this way. So, oh, that's right. The other scenario that I was going to talk about is if the quarter measure set were too difficult for you, and what I was just showing, you would start with 12th measure both hand sets. 12th measure both hand sets would basically just be chord to chord, chord to chord, chord to chord, 12th of a measure plus 1 more chord. And then the next time that you come back, you could link some of the 12ths into 6, or you could link the 12ths into a quarter. I know that there's probably still a lot of unanswered questions, but the funny thing is, the deeper that you get into strategy, the more questions come up. Sometimes I say it's like reading your first chess book that you just bought off of Amazon or something. It's really just the very beginning of the journey, even if you read the book cover to cover. And I hope I've given you some flavor of that. So I might do quarter measure both hand sets through the whole page. Some of them might be 12ths, but then the next pass through, I would link them into quarters. Then the next pass through, I would link the quarter measure both hand sets into half measure both hand sets. Then the next pass through, I would link the half measure both hand sets into one measure both hand sets. And again, if you search David Chang, adding in reverse for both hands, that is one of the layers of strategy. And so I hope you find some of these videos useful if you reference other ones as well, because otherwise this video will be like dozens of hours long probably. So that's the gist of it. If you are stuck in a given place, that's the beautiful thing about a notational system. Don't get stuck. Try to just move on to something else. Do the best that you can. Don't be one of those people that just writes like a few markings and then doesn't do anything else. Sometimes if the student shows up and they've written 4 markings, I'm like, oh, why don't you just skip this part and then do the entire rest of the page? If you're trying to do something and you're totally stuck, it's probably also because you're trying something that's too difficult. How about doing something even smaller? How about doing it separate hands instead of both hands? How about doing a 12th of a measure instead of a quarter of a measure? Anyway, let me know your questions, thoughts, and what applications does this have for you? Are there things that you're curious about? Obviously, I can't go to a super detailed answer, but I am happy to answer at a very high level. Maybe it'll be inspiration for future videos as well too. So if you found this useful, please like, subscribe, let other people know about the channel, and looking forward to the next one.